Welcome to the Redcaps Podcast, a podcast where we dip our caps into the blood of our listeners and we ramble on about old school games. In today's episode, we are going to talk with Ian from BlackDragon Games about his D&D camp that he runs for youth in the Greater Toronto area. As always, I hope you can sit back, listen, and enjoy. I want to apologize up front. Some of the audio might be a little bit uneven between Ian and I, but it seems pretty listenable, so hopefully nobody notices and you can enjoy the episode. So with that, I sent it to past Kevin and past Ian to walk you through the interview. All right, we are here with Ian. Ian, you are known as BlackDragon Games. And part of the reason I wanted to have a chat with you in this episode was that you run a D&D day camp for kids in both of our areas, because I live in the Greater Toronto area as well. Can you tell me a little bit about you and about the camp, and then we'll go from there?
Yeah, sure. So with respect to me, I started this business, I guess, 3 years ago. I was looking for something else to do because my main occupation wasn't making me the kind of money I needed. So I thought I'd start up something else. It was also just related to sort of something. I enjoy D&D quite a bit. And it really came from running some summer camps for my son and his friends. They had, for a couple of years there, I ran summer camp for my son and his 7 friends. And one of the parents approached me at one point and asked me why I wasn't charging them for it, because, you're running a week worth of D&D, you could charge us money for that. And it kind of dropped the seed in my head. And then I went ahead with the after school program after that. So I ran it through a local community center. That's how I got my initial groups, because I didn't really know what to do with respect to advertising. It's not my thing. So I had found at the JCC at Spitfire and Bloor. They gave me a space to use, and I started up the first year. I think I had 2 groups, 2 days a week, and I ran it as an after-school program. So it wasn't, I guess it's D&D focused because I'm doing D&D. I could have done other things too, but it was mainly designed as an after-school program. So the kids in it are anywhere from 8 to 14 years old before they age out. Most of the groups are somewhat more homogeneous in age, like you get a bunch of 10-year-olds, a bunch of 11-year-olds, and stuff like that. And it sort of took off from there. It's been word of mouth since then. Last year I had 7 sessions going, which was far more than I should have. But that's, it's a business, right? So you take all the work you can get. This year was down to 3 sessions or 4 sessions a week. And coming into September, I'm not sure where it's going to land yet, because the parents are all deciding who can make it and who can't. It'll probably be 3 to 4 sessions a week as well. So
very cool. Is it a situation where it's completely you as the DM and all the kids are players, or is there like a workshop where you're teaching them how to be DMs and they eventually start running some of their own sessions, or how does that work?
So there's been sort of 2 things with respect to that. The idea with the program was that you'd learn how to run the game while you were there if you were interested. That was the idea. I'm very much a big believer in, every time players join my game and stick around for a few months, I offer to buy them a copy of Osric and get them to it for free, so they can play on their own. And a bunch of them, of course, had home games going anyway, and generally in 5e on their own before they came. That's why they were interested in it. But yeah, I actively encourage people to run their own games. I've offered to let them run it during the after school program before. No one's taken me up on that one yet. But about half of my players go on to, in terms of, I ask them, every little once in a while, do you run your own games or you just play here? And about half my players are running games of their own. That's always been the idea. I'm a big believer, partially because I run OSR games. I'm a big believer in the fact that you can be a D&D DM on the cheap. I don't think you really have to spend a lot of money if you don't want to. There's used books to get. There's lots of resources available, lots of free resources available. So yeah, I actively encourage the players to run their own games, and about half of them do. And I surveyed them a little further once I found this out, and I'd say about a quarter of them run old school games, and the rest of them run 5e, because that's what their friends want to run. But they learn the basics of GMing with me, and then they take that and they run that in the 5e games.
I'm a big fan of the inexpensive games as well. One of the games I usually tell anybody when they're looking at OSR in any capacity is I direct them towards Basic Fantasy RPG.
Yep.
Just for free PDFs and super cheap books. Osric is another great choice, and my OD&D choice for folks would be White Box. But yeah, I'm right there with you. I think those are great systems to give a good solid foundation on things, and inexpensive, and you can outfit a whole party for the price of a couple of pizzas with books and dice and
Yeah.
everything.
I think the big advantage for me to the OSR is there's been 40 years of materials published that are compatible with it, right? So if you're running any of the early editions of D, doesn't have to be, I run first edition, that's just me, but you can run any of the early editions of D&D pretty much, and they can be roughly compatible with a whole mountain of materials that are available out there for you, either on the cheap or free. So it strikes me as a pretty easy choice, right? That's why I'm creating a retro clone that's plugged into this stuff, because it'll be compatible with lots of different old school systems, lots of different materials. I think that's I don't think you should have to spend a mountain of money to play role-playing games. I really don't. And I think the resources are out there, so, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. And in a way, the whole idea of the day camp is pretty cool. Is that you're getting back to that vibe that I think most adults that play games now, especially if they're playing OSR games, kind of envy the whole having an entire day session of of a game.
Yeah,
I can't remember the last time that's ever happened with me. It's
yeah. I have to admit, I started with summer camps again, as I mentioned. I started with my son and his friends, and they were just awesome fun. Like, so much fun to be able to play for an entire, good chunk of hours, and you don't have to rush. That was the other big thing. My after school groups, there's a sense of immediacy and urgency to it, right? They want to get to where they're going because they're only there for 2 hours, and then they have to wait a week. But when you're running a 1 week long game, or you're playing for multiple hours every day, you can kind of, sit back and explore and take your time, which is something they don't always feel they can do. So that's nice as well. You can really sort of get into it and give them the time to sort of poke around and see what's going on and try different things, which is a lot of fun. So
whenever you first started pitching this, was it a difficult? Obviously, for your son and his friends, they knew it was coming, but for the community group, or for parents of kids that hadn't done any of this before, was it a hard pitch to be like, "Hey, come play D&D"? What was the general reaction before and after?
At all. Before, like the very first time when I approached the JCC, I had no customer base, so I basically said, "Would you allow me to advertise through you?" So they have a computer screen up in the front desk where they sort of flip what programs are being offered all the time. They put out a newsletter. So I basically said, "Can you use your existing sort of advertising juggernaut to advertise me doing D&D games and after school?" And there was no issues at all with any of the parents or any of the kids. They were all eager and ready to go. I think, I joke about this a lot sometimes on Twitter as well, that 5e has really created a mountain of business for me because it gets people knowing that D&D exists. Then they show up to me and they say, "We're here, we playing 5e?" And I go, "Nope, we're not. We're playing first edition." And it's interesting because some of them get a little out of sorts about that. They're like, "Oh, wait a minute, I thought we were going to play 5e." And I'm very clear about it. Like, no, this is what we do. And if you're not happy, I can refund your parents and you can go. And I just said, try a session, see what you think. And in every single case, after the first session, they're like, "This sounds like fun, let's do it." And they're fine. Right? Kids just want to play. They don't really care about the system. They care about the system insofar as their friends are playing the system and they want to be able to play it too. So they all purchase the books on their own. So most of the kids that are in my after school programs, they bought 5e books and stuff like that so they can run it. And there's enough rough similarities that it's a pretty easy transition. What they're learning from me is sort of a style or approach to the game, rolling in the open, accepting the consequences of the dice, letting the dice be generative, things like that. And those to some degree transcend editions, right? So I didn't have any pushback from the kids, except some of them would say, "Well, I thought we were playing 5e." So I'd give them, I contacted the parents and said, "Look, if your child was, super invested in playing 5e, I'm not doing that. So, you're welcome to, I can refund you or whatever." No one's ever taken me up on it. With respect to the community at large, there's been no concerns at all. There've been no instances where parents have pushed back against content in the game. I do put out, before they start, I give them a sheet that asks them a bunch of questions about what they're comfortable and not comfortable with, because I figured that could cause an issue, right? Because, to give you one example, most D&D settings, and mine certainly, are polytheistic, right? So individual characters will worship gods, and they're not Christian gods, they're pagan gods. So you never know, right? There might be a parent that's like, "I don't know if I'm comfortable with my kid running a character that worships, whatever, Hecate, or whatever the case might be." So I have a questionnaire initially that says, "Are you comfortable with your child playing in a setting where there's polytheistic religions? Are you comfortable with your child playing in a setting where they'll be occasionally need to use violence to achieve their ends? Are you, it's that kind of stuff." So I pre-screen a little. Again, I have never, at least 3 years and probably around 80 or 90 players between all those different groups I have, and a single parent say, oh, okay, forget it. We're not going to let my child play because you use polytheistic religions or anything like that. No one's responded to any of these questions with a no, but I do ask them ahead of time, and that may pre-filter to a certain degree. So I don't know, but that's been it. I haven't advertised at all beyond the initial year that I advertised. I now rely on word of mouth. I have a couple of players that are brothers or sisters of players that played with me before, because their older brother, their older sister plays like, oh, I'd like to play too. And then once they get old enough, I plug them into a group and they do that. But it's been pretty generative on its own since I started it. And I haven't had any issues like that.
Were most of the parents like previous players as well? And they were just like, oh yeah, I want to get my kid into D&D as well. Or were they just like, I heard about this D&D thing. Here, go check it out.
It's interesting no, not really. I think of all the parents that I've spoken to over the last 3 years, maybe about 7 or 8 of them had played it back in the day. Most of my kids are coming to it because they've heard about D&D because it's popular and they want to try it. That's what it is. So it isn't generational in that sense. It's although there have been, I'd say there've been 5, 6, or 7 parents over the years that have said, "Oh yeah, I used to play back in the day," but none of them are active gamers. Like none of them play now. They played back in high school a couple of times, and that was about it. So no, that hasn't been a big factor in it as far as I can tell.
So one of the big things that you often hear is a differing between newer school gaming, 5e, Pathfinder, have you, versus older school like Ozeric or first edition old D&D that gets talked. Sorry, go ahead.
You mean my players? What do they say?
No, I was going to say what often you hear between these two groups of folks is a difference on the topic of like safety cards and X cards and all that. Is that something that you've had an issue with, or is your pre-screening kind of take care of most of that?
The pre-screening takes care of, I suspect, the majority of that. Because one of the questions I ask is, does your child have any phobias or fears that I need to be aware of before the game starts? And I've had a couple of parents respond to things like, yes, they have a fear of, spiders or a fear of that. I've had one instance in game. I didn't use the screening sheets when I first started. I started them in second year. My first year of gaming, I had one participant who had a fear of spiders. And when we were playing, they encountered some spiders, and she's like, nope, I don't want spiders. I'm like, what's going on? And she's like, oh, I'm afraid of spiders. I'm like, oh, all right. And it's like, would you prefer they just not be in the game at all? And she's like, yes. All right. So I just took them out. I changed them into something else in the moment. And then I revisited it, every couple of months. I sort of look at her and say, so we still not keen on spiders? And she's like, yep, nope, not interested. I'm like, all right. And then she's been playing with me now for 3 years. And about halfway through year 3, she came to the session once and said, I'm okay with spiders now. And so we just put him back in the game, and that was it. Like it was, so yeah, one of the things that I'm always like, I'm not against safety tools. It's fine. I'm using that's great. My main beef, if you want to call it that, is that if somebody doesn't use the particular form of safety tools that's being advocated for right now, they quite often get labeled in a way that they don't care about their players or whatever. But if you've ever sat down and run a session of D&D and done it well and had people come back for more, one of the number one skills you learn, this is my opinion, obviously, is a degree of ability to read people and have some empathy, right? I can tell when my players are uncomfortable because they signal it in their face and their body language and the way they talk, what they do, what they say. They're 10 to 14-year-old kids. They're not hard to read. So for the most part, when they're uncomfortable about something, they just say they're uncomfortable about something. And sometimes I have to ask and check. After you don't seem real happy about this. Is there something you want to talk about? I had a student one time, or I had a participant one time that kept asking what time it was. What time is it? What time is it? What time is it? I'm like, you could just look at the clock. And she looked at me and said, I can't read clocks. I don't know how. I don't know how to read analog clock. Like she couldn't read like a clock with 2 hands on it. She didn't know how to read it. It's like, oh, okay, fine. And so, you adjust on. But I guess what I'm getting at is that I've always found that most issues with players can be addressed by just being empathetic and being aware and being sort of plugged into how they're feeling about the game at the time. And that's dealt with most things, and the pre-screening form deals with anything else significant. And I haven't had any issues yet. I could, get surprised one day. I've had a couple of kids that were developmentally delayed, I believe is the proper term for it now, who parents either did or didn't tell me ahead of time, and I found it as we were playing. But that was never an issue. You just sort of adjust, you pivot when you're playing, right? So if they're having a moment and they can't focus, you just you continue with the game and let them come back when they are focused, right? I had a player in my summer camp this week who was very He was an outsider. He wasn't part of the regular group. The regular group for the summer campaign was my Tuesday night group. They just did a summer camp with me too. But they asked a friend of theirs from out of province to join them because he was in for a holiday. So he was there, and he was absolutely incapable of handling anything other than success. If he rolled and missed, he threw up his arms, he'd flip the book, he'd get upset, he'd walk away from the table, he'd say, I can't handle this right now, it's too upsetting for me. I don't want to be here anymore. And anything that didn't work out in his favor. And, that's obviously disrupting and difficult, particularly because everybody else that was there was well used to failing things and being able to cope with it, right? Because they played with me for a couple of years. So, we handled that in the moment. We handled that in the moment on the game. And I said, look, if you need a few moments to go catch your breath and get yourself together, that's cool. You can do that. Like, we can stop the game. You can take a few minutes. So we did. We'd stop for 5 minutes. He'd go, he'd walk out of the room, he'd breathe, he'd come back in, he'd say, okay, I'm good now.
Yeah, I think that's always been, I don't have an issue with the idea of safety tools in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. I've just always felt that they have masked a unwillingness to want to communicate with players. Like, it's always felt like the same effect can be achieved by simply having open and honest conversations as opposed to having to come up with specialized forms and tools. And that sounds like exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges to this is that, look, you have to be very honest about these things, right? It's entirely possible that someone could be sitting at my table unhappy and I wouldn't know it, right? Because some people don't, my father used to have an expression, but I won't repeat it because it's not pleasant, but basically you wouldn't say X if you didn't have a mouthful of it. You know what I mean? Like, some people just aren't going to say anything. And I get that. And I think it's entirely possible someone could suffer in silence at your table for a period of time because you weren't aware of things. But I also know that if that kind of person is at your table, a safety tool or form isn't necessarily they aren't going to hit the X card because maybe they'll be self-conscious about that, right? If they're self-conscious about saying, I'm not happy with what you're doing, they could very well be self-conscious about an X card too. My concern about safety tools is essentially that what you're saying, right? People think, you fill out the form and you're done, and that's going to address your problems. And it isn't, because new things can come up in game that don't get captured by the form anyway, right? What really you need to do is you need to be attentive and empathetic. That's really what a good dungeon master is someone that can be sitting at a table full of people, see what everybody's doing, and realize this person isn't happy right now. This person isn't comfortable. And I'll relate a quick anecdote to you. I had a DD, developmentally delayed student in my Friday after school game 2 years ago. And at one point I contacted the mother and said, look, I get the sense that Steven's not really in a good space right now in the game. And she's like, well, how can you tell? And I'm like, well, I was watching his hands. And normally when he's playing, he piles up dice. That's what he does. It's his tick, right? He piles up dice. And he wasn't piling up dice. Instead, his hands were flat on the table and he was sitting in an odd way. So I got the feeling he wasn't happy. And she's like, you're exactly right. When he gets stressed or unhappy, he, instead of fidgeting with things, he just sort of sits there and stares. She's like, how did you know that? I'm like, well, because it was unusual behavior. Like, I'm sitting watching my players for 2 hours every week. I get to know their body language. I get to know their tone of voice. I get to know the way they when they do and don't speak, and if they speak at an unusual time, you notice that. I think this is a skill that good DMs have. They're very attentive to their players. I'm also a teacher, by the way, and it's the same thing when you teach. If you're standing in front of a room full of students and you can see their faces, you can often tell when they don't understand. And you can say, okay, I can see some of you aren't picking up on this. Let's try again. It's the same sort of skill. It's not ideal, and it's not, flawless. I can miss things. I can have a bad day and not pay attention. But I think that's probably more important than the forms. I think being attentive in the moment when you're at the table with the people and noticing group dynamics and stuff. Like, you also notice other things. I notice when a particular player talks over all the other players, and you say, look, Bob, you're talking over everybody, give them a chance to say something. I've noticed, you notice when someone's particularly strident, so the particular player bites the other player's head off, you'd be like, whoa, okay, Bob, what are you doing there? Is there something we need to talk about? Is there something you're concerned about? So I think active and open communication and pivoting and stuff is what's really important to handling people being upset or hurt, right? More so than anything else. And of course, the other thing to keep in mind is there are things you could deliberately do to tick off your players or tick off people, but there's also things you might unintentionally do. So you have something in the setting that you had they didn't even know necessarily was something that was upsetting to them. You got to be reasonable about that and say, okay, I get that that's not good for you, so let's pivot and figure it out in the moment, not blame people for not, using the right piece of paper when they started the game. I think that's ridiculous. So I know it. I want to be careful about this because I'm not suggesting you shouldn't use them. If they work for you, that's fantastic. But I don't think any of those things are enough on their own. I give a questionnaire out for a reason because it solves a lot of this before they even hit my table. But that doesn't mean I don't expect there's not going to be adjustments or things that need to be done when you're actually playing. Of course there are, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think just like you said, paying attention to the kids. I coach hockey, and it's the same thing. You have to be aware of the kids that you're in charge of, or if it's a table, whether it's adults or children. The people that you are presenting things to, be aware of how they're receiving it. And I think that resolves most of the problems, or at least makes you aware of them so that you can then go and find the proper resolution for them.
There's also a trust thing in the background here that I think is worth highlighting too. My players trust me. They trust me to listen. They trust me to be fair. So if they come to me and they say that a decision I made isn't fair, I immediately put it back to the table and say, okay, let's talk. Let's see, what do you think was unfair about that? Do you think I've done it differently for other people, but not the same way for you? My players trust me. So if they're uncomfortable, they tell me, I'm not comfortable with this, because they know that I will honor that and respect it and say, okay, well, then let's see how we can make you comfortable, or let's see what we need to change. I often wonder if people who are saying, well, maybe they wouldn't say anything to you. Well, maybe people don't say anything to you because they don't trust you. Maybe you've responded in such a way in the past. They need that X card because they don't trust you to actually listen to them. You know what I mean?
That's entirely possible as well. And you can kind of see that at times, depending. Now, I don't know whether it's a representation of what that person would be like at the table, but you see that person, say, on social media discussing this issue, and you can maybe get a sense of that as well at times. But so it's been a couple of years of doing this. Is it all one campaign world that they're all playing in, or do you do very separate worlds and separate scenarios? Or
it's all the same. So just as if anybody wants to do this, here's a couple of pieces of advice I can give you. So first of all, I do run a shared world, so everybody adventures in the same world. So one quick example of that is I had my Tuesday group. I sent them into White Plume Mountain, and they lasted about 2 sessions, and then they noped out because they lost, they had 5 henchmen die, and one of the players almost died, and they're like, we're not ready for this. It's too much for us. So they turned and they pivoted and they left. And then my Wednesday group finished off what they were doing and were looking for another thing to do, and they shared a patron. They had the same patron. So I said, well, let's see what happens. So the patron offered them the opportunity to go into White Plume Mountain, and they said, sure. And they went in and they cleared it out, or at least they cleared out a section of it and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a shared world for everybody. I do that primarily because it saves me some work. I also reuse adventure hooks from different groups. So all of my groups there are a couple of scenarios or adventures that I've run that all my groups have run through. They don't obviously meet each other because they play on different days. So that solves the problem of them sharing information. But yeah, I often run sessions like individual adventures for more than one group because if you want to be generating that much, I was running 7 games last year. So, 7 days a week, every week running sessions. If you don't reuse some material, it's not going to be possible, right? It's too much. So
I was going to ask if how you handle conflicting timelines, but yeah, you were just, so if that doesn't come up, if they're all well separated, or if they're all playing on different days and you're using real world time as game time or something, then I guess you can avoid all of that.
Yeah, I roughly coordinate that. These are kids, right? And this is a business. So I'm not, if I happen to slip up and make a mistake with respect to this, I don't care. it's not going to end the campaign. They're not so immersed in it that if I make a timing mistake, they're going to notice. They're 10 to 14 years old. They just want to hit things with their sword and have fun. So a lot of the stuff, this is one of the reasons why I have to be very careful on Twitter and social media when I engage and discuss these sorts of things, because I often realize that I'm playing with kids. Kids just want to play. That's it. There's nothing more complicated to it than that. Adults, it's a whole different ballgame. Things can mean stuff to them or have implications for them or whatever the case might be. Now, if the kids show up, they just want to roll some dice. That's all it is. And it's one of the reasons I like playing with kids. It's a lot less complicated, right? It really, really is. And there are different issues with kids. So to give you another example, I ran a 1-week summer camp. We played from 10 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. And when we started, one of the parents sort of wrinkled their nose and said, well, why aren't you playing for 6 to 8 hours? Why are you only playing for 5 hours? I looked at them and I said, you try running a D&D game for 10-year-olds for more than 5 hours. Give it a spin. See what happens. And it's just, they're not of an age where they can sit for 5 hours or for more than 5 hours. Like, it's not going to happen. And we would often take breaks. So I noticed they were getting goofy and they just couldn't focus. We'd take a break. We'd say, okay, we're taking a break. And we'd take like a half an hour break and they'd go in the backyard and run around or whatever the case might be. Then we'd all regroup and sit down at the table ready to go. So kids are a very different beast than adults are at that age group, right? They get very invested in things in a different way, but you have to understand that there's going to be days they just want to be silly. And there's nothing you can do about that. So if you're one of these DMs that likes tonal settings, so I want this to be a grimdark campaign, and people have serious names. You can't do that with 10-year-olds because some days they're going to come in dead serious, wanting to run a grimdark campaign with serious names. The next day they're going to want to be Mr. Poopy Poopy Pants and hit people with diapers. Like it's just they're kids, so you've got to know that and allow for it, not let it get you worked up, and not let it get you to the point where you're like, you're not respecting my campaign. It's like, oh, chill out, right? You're kids.
Exactly.
It doesn't work like that. And you can make exceptions for them. So I had one kid that wanted to play a dwarf, and I looked at him and I said, kid, I don't do dwarves. There are no dwarves in my campaign world. But they just were desperate to play a dwarf. I'm like, all right, you're the one dwarf in my campaign world. You came from a place across the sea. They loved that. That was great. And so they got to be the one dwarf in my campaign for a year, right? Because I'm not a monster. I'm not an ogre. I'm not going to say, no, you can't do that because they're a child, right? So of course they can do that. But then again, I'm not changing the entirety of my setting for them either, right? Because I put a lot of work in it and I want it to have a certain, tonal synchronicity, as they say. So I just make an exception for them and everything works. You can do a lot of that kind of, I see a lot of people online getting very bent out of shape about stuff like this. And I'm like, well, then just be reasonable about it, right? You don't have to change your whole game world for one player. I think that's probably unreasonable. You've done a lot of work. You put a lot of effort into it. I think it's perfectly fair to say no to them. But if they really, really want to do it, then make it work somehow. Figure it out. Hack it, right? That's what we're supposed to be able to do when we play role-playing games, right? Hack the game. Well, hack the game for them. Figure it out.
Especially if you're playing an OSR style game. I mean, it's kind of what the whole movement is based off of is being flexible and changing and making rulings. So that should be something that's common in terms of a person's mental space for something like that.
I have a rule at my table, which is that if there's something that's come up that isn't covered in the rule set, because that happens sometimes, right? It happens every session. Somebody proposes something that isn't covered by the rules. Then I think it out loud. I say, well, here's what I think are the options and here's what I'd roll for it. And then I get the table to agree to it. If they don't agree to it, we go back and we tweak it until everybody agrees to it. That's my version of consensus. Anything that isn't covered by the rules, if I come now, having said that, 9 times out of 10, when I say, okay, here's what I think we should do and here's what I think we should roll, they all just say, sure, let's go. Then every once in a while, someone will say, well, wait a minute, what about this? And I'll be like, oh, okay, well, then let's change the odds a little bit or weight it a little more this way or the other, or change, you know what I mean? Like you just adjust it on the fly. But that's my version of consent at the table. It's that if there's a ruling that isn't covered by the rules, then we all agree upon what the odds are before we roll, and then we adhere to that if it's done. And that works, relatively well in order to make them feel like they have some say or some hand in what's going on, but also not to dictate everything that's going to happen to them in a way that might seem arbitrary or unfair. But I don't know. I sometimes think people overcomplicate things when it comes to this kind of stuff. Like my main desire is that everybody think it's fair because I'm playing a game. And that's one of the big differences, I think, between what many people in the OSR are doing and not all the OSR. I know this is all very gooey because the categories and stuff like that. But I think many old school players and DMs are very much doing that. I'm running a game and games need to be fair. Games aren't fair. People don't enjoy them. So that means I roll in the open all the time. I don't ever change results. I discuss things with players when things aren't covered by the rules. That's how I handle it being a game. If you're telling a story, it's a different enterprise, right? Then you're sort of saying, well, what will be the most exciting result? What will be the most dramatic result? What will be the most satisfying result? I don't do that. I've never done that. And I never will, because that's not what I'm doing. I'm running a game. And I like that. I like that it's a game. I think making it a game makes it exciting in a different way than telling a story. And I don't think there's anything wrong with the storytelling thing. If you want to do that, have at it. If you want to run a game where the story determines what happens and when it happens and how many encounters you happen and how they resolve themselves, but the players never get to see that because you have it behind the screen, enjoy that. I played games like that are immensely satisfying. I played with DMs that are fantastic at sort of, hiding what's going on, but making you think it's all natural and enjoying the dramatic pacing of the game. You can do that and enjoy it, but it's a different kind of thing. I'm running a game. Games need to be fair, I believe, in order for people to feel they've achieved something in it. And that's the big difference for me, I think, with respect to this. I get a little a little irritated about this when people talk about it, because the reason I like running it as a game is that when my players leave my table, they know they've achieved things without me making it happen for them. And particularly for kids, and that's another thing that biases me a little bit. I'm running games for children. I want kids to feel they've achieved something without me handing it to them. So the example I always give about this is I had a player in one of my first games. He's been with me now for 3 years. He just aged out this past year. He wanted to play a bard. And I told him, well, first edition only has a particular kind of bard. You have to have levels of fighter, levels of as a thief, and then you become a bard. And he's like, no, I want to make a bard. I'm like, you realize this is going to probably take you like 1.5 to 2 years to do. Because that's just it takes about a year to get to around 6th level in my games, is what I've discovered running multiple games. If you play for 80 hours, you can get to 5th, 6th level, depending on your class. So I looked at him and I said, this is going to take you a couple of years. That's fine. So for 2 years, he played this character and he finally became a bard. And he adventured with us for another 4 months, and then his family and then moved, and that was the end of it. But he was so proud of himself for doing this, because I didn't cheat for him. I didn't change the roles. I didn't make it happen faster. I didn't say, fine, just play a bard, we'll make you a bard. He worked for it and he earned it. And he felt like he earned it fairly. I didn't tip the scales. I didn't do anything to make it happen for him. I cannot explain how important it is for kids to have that feeling, have the feeling they've achieved something on their own without it being given to them. You're a coach, you understand it, right? If you achieve something on your own, it means something more. So for me, that frames my entire D&D experience, and it's why I'm not a storytelling GM, because I don't know if you get that same feeling of success and experience and reward when you know that the person running the game is making it happen for you. So, and there's some debate as to whether or not players actually know that, but I'm very skeptical after gaming with me for 80 hours. If I was doing that you wouldn't figure it out. Of course you would. Of course you'd know that mysteriously you survived that hit. Oh, mysteriously you made your saving throw. Like, come on, right?
Yeah, I think it's very obvious to a player whenever a GM is pulling punches. I think, especially because it's impossible for a GM to pull punches and do it consistently and fairly to the point where it's seamless. So it does become obvious very quickly.
And why would you want that responsibility? Why do you want to be the one that could decide who lives and dies and succeeds and fails? Yeah, exactly. I don't want that. Let the dice do the work for me. Forget it.
So every time I chat with somebody and we go through a list of questions, I always feel like I'm missing some very obvious question I should be asking them. So if when you start having discussions with people about the D&D camp or D&D in general, is there something that you wish people would ask you so you could kind of be like, this is an idea that I want to express that nobody asks me about? What is that question, and will you answer it for me?
That's a very good question. So you mean if parents were asking about the after school program, or people just asking about D&D in general?
Either or. Okay. I think both are completely valid.
All right. I think I would tell them, particularly if it was a kid that wanted to run a D&D game of their own and they were thinking about doing it or something like that, I'd say, I wouldn't say it like this. I'd say it like this to you. The perfect is the enemy of the good. Don't worry about getting it right. That'll come with time. I think the single biggest issue I see, and I see this online a lot, people saying things like, oh, I ran a session and it wasn't as good as it could have been. And some of my players didn't have as much fun as they did in the session before that. So I failed. And it's like, oh my Lord, chill out. It's a game. Like, don't worry about getting it right. Particularly with TTRPGs, like whatever edition you pick, those rule books are gigantic, right? You look at those, like even if you pick up 5th edition right now, pick up the Player's Handbook, it's immense, right? Mm-hmm. And the referees books are immense. If you were to start thinking of getting into role-playing games and you went and looked at those things, you'd run screaming. Of course you would, because you're used to playing Monopoly that has a page of instructions. Well, TTRPGs have 500 pages of instructions. So that's my advice, I think, to people who are thinking about getting into the game. Or, I often have people say, my son wants to join your game, but he has no experience. And I'm like, he doesn't have to have any experience. He can have 0 experience. I can have him going in 5 minutes. You don't need to know everything to play. You just need to want to play and be committed to learning. That's it. So that would be my advice for people, because I know that is a high barrier to entry for a lot of people. They don't want to get into the game because they figure it's too complex. They figure it's too many rules to remember. It'll be too hard. It's like, well, so what? Play it anyway and figure it out as you go. I tell people this all the time. The first time I ever played D&D was in high school, and we had the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide, and that's all we had at the time. And we had no idea what we were doing. It was first edition, right? The first edition Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide are terrible books to read. They're hard to understand. They're opaque. They put references in tiny little places. Some of the rules only appear once in a footnote. It's ridiculous, right? So of course you're going to play it wrong. And we played it wrong for an entire summer, every day, and had tons of fun. Some of the best gaming I've ever had. You don't need to get it right to enjoy it. You just need to be committed to playing the game, learning about it, and learning it with your friends, right? I think that's the piece of advice I'd probably give. And that's the thing I tell people that want to get into the game. Just chill out. It's not a story that has to be perfectly told. It's a game that you can learn as you go. Right. So if that answers your question or not, but
that's perfect. I mean, I think that's a perfect is the enemy of good, or hey, you're always going to goof up the first attempt anyway, so just get it over with so that you can then iterate and get better is a fantastic approach. And yeah, just remembering that everything is a game. It's not this isn't a lifelong test that you're going to be marked with if you get something incorrect. It's a time to go have some fun with friends and relax. I think is a good reminder that everybody, not just kids that are coming into it, but even some of the people who have been playing it for a very long time and can occasionally take a very too serious, should also remember every once in a while.
And I'll throw a caveat in there, though. There was one caveat to that, and that's that it doesn't mean you don't need to learn how the game works. You do. Like, so I joke with people at this because I'm making a retro clone, which means essentially I'm homebrewing the game and then publishing that. So clearly I believe in tweaking the rules. But I ran D&D by the book as best I could determine it for decades. Right? I was running the game as it was written. I got to know it really, really well before I started saying, let's take this off, let's change this, let's change that. One of the things about Twitter that makes me pull my hair out, right? You see daily on Twitter someone saying, oh, doesn't work in D&D, this doesn't work in D&D, this doesn't work in D&D. And there's a whole list, right? Hit points, leveling, armor class, class systems, race, alignment, name it. Every single aspect of the game is, and that's fine. I've myself questioned almost every aspect of the game at some point or another, but I learned how it worked first. I ran it the way it was, again, to the best of my ability. I'm sure I didn't get it all right, but I learned to play it the way it was supposed to be played and ran it that way for a while to see how it would work. Then I said, okay, having run this game for, X number of years and seen how it works, I'm not happy with this. I want to tweak it and change it. So although I do think you should have a sort of a loose and relaxed attitude and not worry about getting it wrong, that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to get it right at some point and figure out how the game actually works. I think that's really, particularly if you're going to be going online and telling other people what to do. Right? You're going to be going online saying, you should do this and you should do that. It's like, well, have you actually tried to run it the way it's published? And if you have meaningfully, sure, then I think it's a great conversation to have. But if you haven't even run it the way the game was set up to be run, then what are you talking about? Like, anyway, I find that frustrating too. It's like, know what you're doing before you decide to change it.
Yeah, I caveat that a tiny bit. Now, I'm a big fan of theory crafting and changing stuff, but when I'm talking to people who are playing a game or asking me, I often get the question like, "Hey, what sort of house rules should I put on the game?" And my default answer is generally, don't go and play it as it's written with the table that you have for a couple of sessions, and then see if you and your players have any pain points. So it's not even just so much what the DM likes or dislikes, but also doing it at the table and seeing if the players have parts of that rule set that they don't care for or aren't fun for them, and then deciding on a house rule that solves those problems. I think I often see people saying, okay, I'm going to start up playing, like, Old School Essentials is the most popular thing going right now. I don't know how often I see a thread on Reddit or on Twitter where somebody goes, hey, I'm going to start an Old School Essentials game. What are the best house rules to go? And I view that kind of like somebody who's playing a video game and going, hey, what are the best mods I can put on the game? And it's like, don't do any of that until you've played the game first and seen what it's about, and then change what doesn't work for you. Like, that's totally fine to change what doesn't work for you, but until you actually play it and see if it does or not, you don't know. So that's kind of my view on it.
I'm fortunate in that I run games for kids and they are extremely vocal about what they don't like. So if I have a rule or whatever, like I test out new rules all the time, right? I'm like, okay, this week we're going to try this. Tell me what you think. And they will let me know exactly. And if there's an aspect of the existing rules they don't like that I'm open to changing, they'll tell me, like, you know what, Ian, I don't like this, or I don't like that, or I wish we could do this differently. I'm like, sure, we can try it differently, right? Give it a spin, see what happens. But I get a lot of feedback from my players because they're kind of unfiltered at this age. I think as people get older, they get a little more concerned about social conventions. But 10-year-olds, they don't care. They'll tell you. Vocally most of the time.
Good stuff. Well, thank you, Ian, very much for talking to me. Where can people find you and find out about the camps if they're local to this area, or anything else that you might be doing?
My advice, oddly enough, is contact me on Twitter. I have a web page, but it's currently down and being redone, so it's not available for people to look at. So if they're interested in any of this, just connect to me through Twitter, or if you go to my bio and my profile on Twitter, it's got an email address. You can send me an email too. That would work.
And Ian's Twitter handle is at BlackDragon Can. I assume the can is for Canada.
Yeah.
And I'll have a link to that in the show notes as well if you want to find him that way. Yeah, Ian, thank you so much for jumping on. I know it was kind of I reached out to you via Twitter just because I saw the post and I was like, oh, well, I gotta find out more about this. And so I appreciate you coming on and answering the questions. And hopefully you had a good time.
No, absolutely, I did. And I'm open to, if people want to contact me and ask me about running their own business, doing this, or after school programs for kids, I'm always open to that. I'm very keen on weaponizing this and getting people who enjoy games to run games. I think it's a great thing to do. And if you can have after school camps for soccer, you can have after school camps for chess. I see no reason why you can't do the same thing for D&D. So I'm happy to spread the love.
I agree completely. I think it's fantastic, and I really like the fact that you're getting kids in young at the older editions as well, so that they can then, if they choose to play the later editions, they can see what's changed and what maybe has improved or how the game has changed, but they'll have a little bit of appreciation for where it came from as well. So I thank you for that. I think that's an awesome thing that you're doing for the community, and
thank you.
I hope it's as enjoyable for you as it is for them.
It absolutely is.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Ian, and we'll end this one off here.
Sounds good. Take care.
Want to give a huge thank you to Ian for coming onto the show. It was a lot of fun chatting with him, and I am super envious of those kids that get to play D&D all day and have their parents pay for it and have a professional DM and get to play in old school games. Just totally envious. If you are in the Greater Toronto area and this sounds of interest to you at all, please do get a hold of Ian. He is running camps and he has the after school program. All his contact information will be down in the description of the podcast. And folks, that wraps up this episode of the Redcaps Podcast. I hope you enjoyed, you learned something, and that you're eager to come back for more. Communication options might be getting a little bit weird because Anchor has finally done the thing where they have dropped the voicemail option from their app. But you can always reach me at 385-2REDCAP. That's 385-273-3227. Or you can head over to anchor.fm/theredcaps and leave a voicemail via the web browser. As well, if you go to www.theredcaps.net, it'll have all the links for the ways to contact me. And if I add some more, I'm thinking of adding a couple other ways to get voicemails in, then you'll see it there as well. Anyway, I would love to hear from you. Thank you very so much for listening. And remember, never let your cap dry out. Stay safe. Have fun. We'll talk again soon. Take care.